Hello and welcome back to the school's YouTube account. My name is Emma. I am one of the English language teaching assistants and I am here to help you to learn English. So today will be another book review of sorts. I kind of wanted to tell you the timeline of a few books which interest me, which I would really recommend. The books that I will be talking about are Emma by Jane Austen, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. They are some of my favourite books, and I just want to sort of talk through each one and talk about how they're linked in a very interesting way. So first of all, Emma by Jane Austen, published in 1815. I talked about it at great length in my Jane Austen book shuffle, but to reiterate, I just really liked that it is a book about a flawed character. Emma is a really interesting character where the reader is aware that Emma doesn't know everything that is going on all the time and kind of makes assumptions, makes mistakes, and the book is kind of about her having to live with the consequences and about having to rectify some of the errors that she has made. So that is why it is such a good book, because it is a book that tells you it's okay to get things wrong sometimes. That is why I like it. Again, I gave it a more in-depth review before. Now, Emma to Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte in 1847, I believe. So, of course, it was about 30 years later, but they are linked in an interesting way. So, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, she read Emma, and she was attracted to the idea not of Emma Woodhouse, the main character who came from a very affluent family, but she was interested in one of the side characters who was Emma's old governess, Miss Taylor. And she wanted to write a book from the perspective of a governess or from the perspective of someone who came from a poorer family. And that is how we come with the novel, one of my favourite novels of all time, Jane Eyre. This is actually a Spanish edition because I read it in English and I am now currently reading it again in Spanish. So I do have multiple copies of this book. That is how much I like it. And yeah, I think Charlotte Bronte had the right idea that at the time it was a very new concept to write about the poorer, sort of more working classes. Jane Eyre is a governess, so the story is kind of about her struggle, and the way that Charlotte Bronte writes, her struggle feels very real, that she has to look after herself, look out for herself. She has to gradually learn to trust the people around her, even as she is sort of betrayed by various people. It is just a story about a really wonderful, hard-working woman and watching the work that she put in eventually pay off as she sort of falls in love and comes more into... she learns to connect with her feelings a bit more. At first she is a bit more guarded, then gradually as the novel goes on she becomes a bit more open. She's a very interesting character, I find, just again someone who works hard and is very passionate but has to kind of keep her temper hidden, and we see her struggle with that in the novel. There are also lots and lots of other really good characters. I think some of the underrated ones are her friends like Adele and Mrs. Fairfax, who are her friends at Thornfield Hall. She learns to develop relationships with all these people after being isolated for a really long time. It's really beautiful to watch these friendships develop. It's wonderful to watch her building a new family when she thought having a family was something which was closed off to her. So while Emma Woodhouse in Emma, she is born into a family who loves her and has her family and friends and connections established, and she has her life established. Jane Eyre is about a woman who is trying to craft her own life, not only through her career as a governess, but also trying to build a new family, build relationships, and kind of finding herself a bit more. Again, Emma is very good with showing how people make mistakes and have to live with them. Jane Eyre hasn't got the same theme of making mistakes and being imperfect, but it does have themes like forgiveness, so it is an interesting response to the novel Emma. So Charlotte Bronte wrote that because she wanted to write about, a poorer class, whereas Jane Austen mainly wrote about the middle and upper classes. So that is how those two novels are connected. I don't think you have to pick which one is your favourite. I think you can just love them both. I certainly do. I think Jane Eyre maybe wins because it is one of my favourite novels of all time. But Jane Austen still has written, wonderful, wonderful things, and I'm still a very big fan of hers. So that is Jane Eyre. And then in 1938, we have a book called Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I do think it's interesting how all of these books are women's names. So Emma is from Emma Woodhouse, Jane Eyre is from Jane Eyre, but Rebecca, the name of interestingly, the main character in Rebecca, we don't actually know her name. She's only known as the second Mrs. de Winter. She is Maxim de Winter's second wife, and his first wife was Rebecca. So in Jane Eyre, Jane is Mr. Rochester's second wife, which is a large conflict in the story. She is the second woman to marry Mr. Rochester. So they get married at the end of the book, whereas Daphne du Maurier got very interested in the idea of a woman being a man's second wife and having to step into another woman's shoes. So Rebecca is all about the second Mrs. de Winter living in the shadow of Rebecca, the first wife, and moving into this house which she feels is sort of haunted by the presence of the first wife. It's a really interesting novel. It's probably the darkest and most gothic out of all of them. I will say actually the books kind of get darker as you go along. If you read the 3 books as a trilogy, which I would actually recommend you do, it could be an interesting literary experiment for you. If you read them as a trilogy, they do get darker, they do get more sinister, and they probably get a bit more passionate as they go through. Rebecca is a very emotional, passionate novel. You get some really, really dark stuff. It talks about illness, it talks about death, and talks about all sorts of things, and you really do get this feeling that the main character is being haunted throughout the novel. It's very, very fascinating, going from, you know, Emma by Jane Austen, which is a nowadays we would consider to be quite a lighter novel. It, you know, it's very, very good, but it's not like, I wouldn't term it as a dark novel, to Rebecca, which has very, very sinister moments and kind of starts exploring the psychology of Rebecca, even though she has died. The second Mrs. de Winter becomes obsessed with her and just, you know, keeps exploring her. You then get you know, the psychology of, you know, second Mrs. de Winter, her emotions are at the forefront. Some of the servants who have served both of the wives and clearly prefer one of the wives to the other. Maxim de Winter, who, you know, was married to both of these women, had different relationships with both. Kind of exploring all of these characters and how they interact, it becomes very, very fascinating. It's a very good book. Yes, all of these books are classics, but I think they still, you know, have merit. I think they still have modern relevance. So I would thoroughly recommend all of them. I'm a very big fan of all of them, and just the way they are connected is very interesting. Kind of brings me on to my next point of this idea of like literature. A lot of literature is very, very linked. So I have found links between these 3 books, which you know, started with 1 book and then 2 books responding to the other. You do get a lot of that with books and novels where sometimes the same author or authors who know each other will write about similar subjects but maybe have different takes on it. You get, you know, some books inspired by other books, so such as modern books which are inspired by, say, Jane Austen's book. She, you know, wrote a lot of romances, so you get a lot of romances kind of inspired by her, either modern retellings of these romances or stories which take place at the time but maybe have a bit of a twist to do something a bit different with the sort of cliches that Jane Austen helped to establish. So she did create these ideas, but a lot of people have been playing with them, subverting them for a long time. I think that's one of the reasons I love books so much, because some of these books you can understand that these people are having a conversation. So while there is a story, while there are characters, while there are all these things going on, they are also pleading a case with certain ideas. You know, with Emma, it's all about, you know, how it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay if you're not aware of these things. With Jane Eyre, it is kind of discussing the difficulty of finding a place in the world, with crafting a place if you weren't already given one. And then Rebecca is kind of the horrors of stepping into someone else's place, and this idea of the people who came before you being so influential, which is ironic when you think of the books that came before Rebecca being so influential on Rebecca. But yeah, that is how literature works. So I think if anyone ever tells you that maybe a book, you shouldn't like a book because it's like just a copy of another book, you know, you shouldn't like, say, if you're really into crime novels or detective fiction, people say, oh, you shouldn't like those books because they're basically copies of these books. Lots of books are either copies or responses or just takes on other books. So that is something about literature which you can really, really enjoy, where you can just love books even though they are the same, or even though they're very similar, they might have some differences in them. Literature, you know, books talk to each other and books talk to us. And that is something I really like about these three novels. That is Emma by Jane Austen, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I really enjoy them. You know, if you read them all individually, you can read them individually without a problem. I think I read Jane Eyre before I read Emma, and then later on I read Rebecca. You can read them all separately, absolutely, but if you do read them all as a trilogy, it can be very interesting to see their different takes on the same ideas. But yes, so that is kind of caps my book review and my kind of explanation for why I love literature so much and how these books exemplify it. But I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video. Bye!